Have you ever reached a moment when the people you love stop asking what you want and start deciding what's best for you instead? What if the person who slowly took away your voice wasn't an enemy, but your own son, the child you spent a lifetime protecting? By the time he stood in front of me, holding my late wife's journal with tears in his eyes, the fire had already burned away decades of family history. He thought destroying those old papers would save our family from falling apart. Instead, it uncovered a truth neither of us was prepared to face. Because the greatest thing he lost that day wasn't a box of documents. It was my trust. And by the time he finally begged me to believe he had only been trying to protect me, we both realized the same heartbreaking lesson. The most painful betrayals are often committed by the people who love us the most, when they forget that love should never replace another person's right to choose. For most of my life, I believed a father's greatest success had nothing to do with money. It was hearing his children say, "He gave us a life worth remembering." That was the legacy I thought Helen and I had built together. We raised two boys under one roof, celebrated every Christmas around the same dining table, and filled our home with the kind of memories that I believed no one could ever take away. Looking back now, I realize I was wrong about one thing. Memories can survive almost anything, but the proof that they ever happened can disappear in a single afternoon. The morning everything changed began like hundreds before it. I woke just after sunrise, made myself a cup of coffee, and stood in the kitchen watching the first light spill across the backyard. Ever since Helen passed away 6 years earlier, mornings had become my favorite time of day. The silence didn't remind me that I was alone anymore. It reminded me of everything we'd built together. Then I noticed the smell. At first, it was faint enough to ignore. Around our neighborhood, people often burned fallen branches once summer gave way to autumn. I took another sip of coffee, expecting the smell to drift away with the breeze. Instead, it grew stronger. It wasn't burning wood. It wasn't dry leaves. It was paper. I set my mug on the counter and stepped outside. The smoke was rising from the old burn barrel behind the garage, the one we'd used for years to dispose of garden waste. As I walked closer, I saw someone standing beside it. Michael. He turned as soon as he heard my footsteps. "Morning, Dad." "Morning." I glanced toward the fire. "What VE you got burning?" He smiled, almost amused by the question. "Just cleaning out some old paperwork." I nodded. Honestly, it made perfect sense. Our attic had become a museum of things nobody ever looked at anymore. Appliance manuals, faded receipts, outdated insurance brochures, instruction booklets for machines we no longer owned. More than once I joked that whoever cleaned out that attic after I was gone deserved a medal. "You finally got tired of looking at all that clutter," I said. Michael laughed. "I figured one of us had to." For another minute, we talked about ordinary things. My granddaughter's visit that weekend. Whether the fence would survive another winter. The tomatoes that hadn't grown nearly as well this year. Nothing about the conversation felt unusual. If anything, I remember feeling grateful. People often told me how fortunate I was to have a son like Michael. After I retired, he'd quietly taken over the responsibilities I no longer enjoyed. He dealt with insurance companies, scheduled repairs around the house, organized tax appointments, and never once made me feel like I was becoming a burden. I trusted him because he'd spent years giving me every reason to. By late afternoon, the fire had become nothing more than another ordinary part of the day. I climbed into the attic, hoping to find a scrapbook Helen had made for our oldest granddaughter. She'd spent months putting it together: photographs, handwritten notes, pressed flowers, little pieces of our family's history. The attic looked exactly as it always had. One dusty window. A few old chairs hidden beneath white sheets. Rows of storage boxes lining the wall. Then something caught my attention. There was a space where one of those boxes should have been. Not a pile of boxes knocked over. Not a mess. Just one clean, empty space. I stood there for a moment, trying to remember what had been stored there. It wasn't Christmas decorations. It wasn't old clothes. Then I remembered the nickname Helen had given it years ago. The family box. That's what we'd always called it. Not because it contained anything valuable to anyone else, but because everything inside mattered to us. The original deed to the land before we built our home. Letters Helen wrote while I was working out of state. Birthday cards from the boys when they were little. Property agreements. Old insurance papers. Legal documents. Photographs tucked inside envelopes. Even the leather journal where Helen had written about every major milestone in our family's life. Nothing in that box could be replaced. I searched the attic again. Slowly. Carefully. Maybe I'd moved it months ago and simply forgotten. Maybe Michael had carried it downstairs while cleaning. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation. I wanted there to be one. But when I reached the bottom of the attic stairs, the house felt strangely quiet. I walked to the back door and looked across the yard. The burn barrel was still smoking. Tiny gray flakes drifted upward before disappearing into the evening sky. I couldn't see what had burned. I couldn't prove the family box had ever been inside that fire. And for reasons I couldn't explain. I wasn't ready to ask Michael. Not because I was afraid of the answer, but because, for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I was ready for the question. That evening, I found myself thinking less about the missing box, and more about Michael. Not because he'd done anything unusual. Because he hadn't. He'd smiled. Made jokes. Asked about my granddaughter. Talked about replacing the old fence before winter. If there was something weighing on him, he hid it remarkably well. More than once I caught myself wondering whether I'd let one missing box convince me something was wrong when nothing actually was. After all, memory has a strange way of filling empty spaces with worry. The next morning, Michael arrived carrying a small paper bag from the bakery. "Cinnamon rolls," he announced. "I figured I'd save you from your cooking." I laughed. "You're assuming I was cooking." He smiled. "You only cook when you run out of leftovers." The two of us laughed harder than the joke deserved. For a little while, everything felt normal again. We ate breakfast on the back porch, watching a pair of robins hopping across the lawn. Then, almost without thinking, I asked, "Do you remember your mother's storage boxes in the attic?" Michael nodded. "Some of them. There was one she always seemed especially careful with." He looked at me for a moment. "The photo albums?" "I don't think so." "The Christmas decorations?" "No." Michael leaned back in his chair. "I'm not sure which one you mean." His answer wasn't defensive. It wasn't hurried. If anything, it sounded honest. And somehow, that made it harder. Because if he was lying, he was doing it without the slightest crack in his voice. I let the conversation drift toward easier subjects. Neither of us mentioned the attic again. When Michael finally stood to leave, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "If you're trying to find something," he said quietly, "we'll find it together." Then he smiled. And drove away. I stood in the driveway long after his truck disappeared. Helen used to tell me that whenever two people remembered the same day differently, it didn't always mean one of them was lying. Sometimes, it simply meant they had lived that day for different reasons. I wished she were here to tell me which kind this was. That afternoon, the telephone rang. The screen displayed a name I hadn't seen in years. Thomas Reed. The attorney who had helped Helen and me prepare our wills decades earlier. I answered with a smile. "Thomas, it's been a long time." "It has," he replied. Then his voice became noticeably quieter. "William, I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "Not at all. I just needed to ask you something." "Go ahead." There was a pause. Long enough that I almost thought the call had disconnected. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Last month your son stopped by my office." I frowned. "Michael." Yes. He said you wanted copies of some very old family records. William searched his memory. He couldn't remember asking Michael to collect anything. In fact, he couldn't remember discussing those records with anyone. Thomas continued. I gave him what he requested. Another pause. I assumed you already knew. William looked out toward the backyard. The burn barrel was still sitting behind the garage. Cold now. Silent. Exactly where it had been yesterday. For the first time since smelling smoke. William wasn't wondering what had burned. He was wondering something far more difficult. Why had Michael believed he needed those records in the first place? For the rest of that afternoon, I couldn't stop thinking about Thomas's phone call. Not because he'd accused Michael of anything. He hadn't. In fact, the more I replayed the conversation in my mind, the more ordinary it sounded. A son asking an attorney for old family records wasn't exactly unusual. If I'd asked Michael to organize a few legal papers, that's probably where he would have gone. The problem wasn't what Thomas had said. It was what I couldn't remember. The older you get, people assume memory fades all at once. It doesn't. It disappears in little pieces. A forgotten name. A misplaced pair of glasses. Walking into a room and wondering why you came. I'd experienced all of those. But I had never forgotten asking someone to do something important. Especially something involving the family we'd spent a lifetime building. That night, I pulled an old leather chair beside the living room window where Helen used to read every evening. Whenever life became confusing, she'd sit there with a cup of tea and somehow make everything seem smaller than it really was. I found myself wishing she were there now. She always knew which questions mattered, and which ones only created fear. The following morning, I drove into town to see Thomas. Not because I suspected Michael. Because I wanted to understand my own memory. Thomas greeted me with the same warm smile I'd known for nearly 30 years. You should have called, he said. I would have come to you. I needed to get out of the house. That wasn't entirely true. I needed to look someone in the eye. After a few minutes of ordinary conversation, Thomas opened a thin client folder and rested it on his desk. I assume this is why you're here. William nodded. I don't remember asking Michael to visit you. Thomas didn't look surprised. I wondered if that might be the case. That answer caught me off guard. You did. He leaned back in his chair. When Michael came in, he seemed careful. Careful. Thomas searched for the right word. Almost as though he wanted to make certain he explained everything exactly the way you'd explained it to him. William frowned. What exactly did he ask for? Thomas opened the folder. He requested copies of the original property records, your first will, and several documents from the years before Helen passed away. William listened quietly. Nothing Thomas mentioned sounded alarming. Those papers existed. Michael knew they existed. Requesting copies wasn't illegal. It wasn't even unusual. Then Thomas added one sentence that changed everything. I asked whether you'd be coming in with him. William looked up. What did he say? Thomas hesitated. He smiled and told me. Dad gets overwhelmed by paperwork now. He'd rather I handle these things. The office fell silent. Thomas quickly added. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Neither did William. In fact, it sounded exactly like something Michael might say, because for the past few years, William had allowed him to handle almost everything. Insurance, taxes, appointments, bank meetings. Not because he couldn't do those things anymore. Because it was easier. Because he trusted his son. Thomas closed the folder. William. I need to ask you something. William nodded. Have you and Michael been discussing changes to your estate? William answered without hesitation. No. Thomas's expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for William to notice. "I see." He quietly slid the folder back into his desk drawer. He didn't explain why he'd asked. William didn't ask him to. Sometimes the questions people choose not to answer tell you more than the ones they do. As William stood to leave, Thomas walked him to the front door. Just before William stepped outside, Thomas spoke one final time. "I've known your family a long time." William turned. "If there's one piece of advice I can give you." He paused. "Don't start by asking what your son did." William waited. Thomas's eyes settled somewhere beyond the office window. "Start by asking what he believed was about to happen." The drive home felt longer than usual. Not because William had learned something terrible, but because, for the first time, someone had shifted the question. Until now, he'd been trying to understand Michael's actions. Now he found himself wondering about Michael's fears. And somehow, that felt far more unsettling. Thomas's words stayed with William long after he left the law office. "Don't ask what your son did. Ask what he believed was about to happen." It was the kind of advice that sounded simple until you tried to answer it. For the next 2 days, William stopped searching for explanations. He didn't return to the attic. He didn't look inside the burn barrel. He didn't call Michael. Instead, he tried to remember Helen. Not the final weeks of her illness. The ordinary days before that. Because if anyone understood this family better than he did, it had always been her. Then one memory quietly resurfaced. A few months before Helen died, she'd insisted on visiting Dr. Samuel Harris for what she called one last proper checkup. When William joked that she trusted the doctor more than she trusted him, she'd laughed and replied, "Some conversations are easier with people who aren't family." At the time, he'd thought nothing of it. Now, he found himself driving across town. Dr. Harris answered the door himself. His hair was thinner than William remembered, but his smile hadn't changed. "William. I was wondering when we'd cross paths again." After a few minutes of catching up, William decided not to circle around the reason he'd come. "Helen asked you something before she passed away." The doctor's expression softened. "So, you've started asking questions." William nodded. "I don't even know if I'm asking the right ones." Dr. Harris gestured toward the living room. "That usually means you're closer than you think." They sat in silence for a moment before the doctor spoke. "A few weeks before Helen died, she asked me something I'd never been asked by a patient." William waited. "She wanted to know whether grief changes the way people make decisions." William frowned. "What did you tell her?" "I told her grief doesn't always make people irrational. It often makes them afraid." The doctor looked toward the bookshelf where decades of medical journals still sat untouched. Helen thought about that answer for a long time. Then she smiled sadly. And she said, "Promise me one thing." William felt his chest tighten. "If anything ever happens to me, don't let anyone mistake helping William for choosing on his behalf." The room fell silent. Dr. Harris folded his hands. She wasn't worried about money. She wasn't worried about the house. She was worried that people who loved you might slowly stop asking what you wanted. William lowered his eyes. That sounded exactly like Helen. She had never feared bad intentions. She feared good intentions taken too far. As William stood to leave, Dr. Harris called after him. "There's one more thing." William turned. "I saw Michael a few weeks after Helen's funeral." William looked surprised. "You did?" The doctor nodded. "He didn't come for medical advice. He came because he couldn't stop asking the same question." "What question?" Dr. Harris looked at William for a long moment before answering. "How do you know when helping someone becomes controlling them?" William stood perfectly still. That wasn't the question of a selfish man. It was the question of someone already afraid of the person he might become. The drive home felt different from every drive before it. For the first time, William wasn't wondering whether Michael had done something wrong. He was wondering when Michael first realized it himself. As William turned into the driveway, he saw Michael standing beside the old burn barrel. He wasn't looking into it. He wasn't touching it. He was simply standing there, staring at the cold ashes, as though they reminded him of something he wished had never happened. I didn't tell Michael I'd spoken to Dr. Harris. I wanted to. More than once, I picked up the phone. Each time, I put it back down, because I wasn't ready to hear an answer before I understood the question. That evening, Michael knocked on my front door carrying a toolbox. "I noticed your porch light flickering," he said. "Thought I'd replace it before it burned out." I smiled. "You've always had good timing." "I try." For the next 20 minutes, neither of us mentioned the attic, or the missing family box, or Thomas, or Dr. Harris. We talked about baseball, the neighbor's new dog, whether my grandson was still thinking about college. Watching him work, I found myself asking the same question over and over. How could someone who cared this much also be hiding something? When he finished replacing the light, we sat on the porch as the evening grew quiet. Finally, Michael spoke. "Dad, I've been meaning to ask you something." I looked over. "Go ahead. Have you ever thought about selling the house?" The question caught me completely off guard. "Selling it?" He nodded. "It's a lot for one person. The stairs, the yard, the repairs. You've looked after this place long enough." There was nothing unreasonable about what he said. Friends had suggested the same thing. Even Helen and I had talked about downsizing years ago. But hearing it now, after everything else, felt different. I smiled politely. "I'm not ready." Michael nodded almost immediately. "I understand." And to my surprise, he never tried to convince me otherwise. The conversation moved on. When he finally drove away, I stood on the porch watching his truck disappear. Something about the evening didn't fit. If Michael wanted the house, why accept my answer so easily? The following afternoon, my younger son Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. Unlike Michael, Daniel had moved 3 states away years earlier. We spoke often, but surprise visits were rare. He walked into the kitchen, hugged me tightly, then looked around the house with a smile. "Still smells like Mom's apple pie in here." William laughed. "I think that's just the old wood." For a while, they talked about ordinary things. Then Daniel grew unusually quiet. "Dad, I almost didn't come." William frowned. "Why?" Daniel hesitated. "Because Michael told me you didn't want visitors for a while." William stared at him. He said, "What?" Daniel looked confused. "He told me you wanted some space. He said you were tired. And that too many people dropping by was overwhelming you." William felt his stomach tighten. "I never said that." Daniel's expression slowly changed. "You didn't." William shook his head. "No." Neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel let out a slow breath. I thought it sounded strange. "You've never pushed family away." William looked out the kitchen window. His thoughts weren't racing. They were settling. Quietly. Carefully. This wasn't proof. Michael hadn't stolen money. He hadn't forged a signature. He hadn't threatened anyone. But once again, someone had made a decision, based on something William had supposedly wanted, without William ever saying it. Daniel broke the silence. "Dad, can I ask you something?" William nodded. "When Mom passed away, did you ask Michael to start speaking for you?" William answered immediately. No. Daniel looked down at his coffee. Then he whispered, "Why does everyone seem to think he was?" The question lingered in the room long after neither man had anything left to say. That night, William sat alone on the back porch. He wasn't trying to decide whether Michael was guilty anymore. He was trying to understand something far more painful. At what point had his family stopped asking William what he wanted, and started asking Michael instead? Daniel's question stayed with William long after he'd gone home. Why does everyone seem to think Michael was speaking for you? It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. And somehow, observations are much harder to argue with. For the first time since the burn barrel, William stopped asking himself whether Michael had made one bad decision. Instead, he began wondering whether something much quieter had happened over the years. Not a lie. A habit. The following Saturday, William attended his great-granddaughter's 8th birthday party. It was the first family gathering in months. Children ran through the backyard chasing balloons while the adults gathered beneath a large maple tree, talking about work, retirement, and rising grocery prices. Everything looked normal. William wanted it to feel normal. As he carried his plate toward the patio, his niece, Laura, smiled and waved. "Uncle William," she said, "I'm so glad you came." "So am I." They talked for a few minutes before Laura casually asked, "Are you feeling better?" William looked puzzled. "Better? You know." She hesitated. "After everything you've been going through." William frowned. "I'm afraid you've lost me." Laura looked confused. "I thought Michael said you've been having trouble making decisions since Aunt Helen passed." William felt his chest tighten. "He told you that?" She nodded. "Not in a bad way. He was worried about you. He said you didn't like dealing with paperwork anymore." William forced a small smile. "Well, I certainly don't enjoy paperwork." They both laughed. But inside, something shifted. Laura hadn't been gossiping. She hadn't been trying to embarrass Michael. She genuinely believed she was describing reality. A few minutes later, William wandered toward the drinks table. As he reached for a glass of lemonade, he heard two distant relatives talking nearby. They didn't realize he could hear them. "I'm glad Michael's looking after his dad," one of them said. "Me too," the other replied. "These things happen." "What things?" "You know. When older people start depending on someone else." William quietly stepped away before they noticed him. Not because he was angry. Because he understood something that hadn't occurred to him before. No one thought Michael had taken control. They thought William had given it to him. That evening, after the party ended, Michael drove William home. The ride was unusually quiet. Halfway there, William looked out the passenger window and asked, "Do you remember teaching Tommy how to ride his bicycle?" Michael smiled. "He kept crashing into the mailbox." William laughed. "And every time he fell, you told him to get back on." Michael nodded. "He eventually did." Another silence settled between them. Then William asked, almost absent-mindedly, "When did you decide I couldn't get back on?" Michael's hands tightened ever so slightly on the steering wheel. "What do you mean?" William kept looking out the window. "I've been thinking. For a long time now. People have been asking you what I want. They don't ask me anymore." Michael didn't answer. William wasn't even sure he'd heard him. When they pulled into the driveway, neither man got out immediately. The engine continued idling. Finally, Michael spoke. "I never asked anyone to stop talking to you." William nodded. "I believe you." Michael looked surprised. "But..." William continued quietly. "I don't think you ever told them they should keep asking me." For the first time in days, Michael didn't have an answer. He stared through the windshield, saying nothing. Not because he was caught. Because, perhaps for the first time, he was asking himself the same question. And William suddenly realized something that frightened him more than any missing document ever could. This hadn't happened because of one terrible decision. It had happened. One small, well-intentioned decision at a time. Michael didn't call again for almost a week. When he finally did, his voice sounded exhausted. "Dad. Can you come over?" William didn't ask why. Some conversations announce themselves long before they begin. Michael was waiting on the porch when William arrived. Neither man hugged. Neither reached for a handshake. They simply walked inside and sat across from one another at the dining room table. For several minutes. The only sound came from the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Finally, Michael stood and disappeared into the study. When he returned, he wasn't carrying a box. He was carrying a single leather-bound journal. William recognized it immediately. Helen's journal. His hands tightened. "I thought." William whispered. "It burned." Michael slowly shook his head. "No. It was the only thing I couldn't throw into that fire." William stared at the worn leather cover. Then what was burned? Michael looked down. Copies. Old files. Letters. Property records. "I burned everything except this." William frowned. "Why keep the journal?" Michael's answer came without hesitation. "Because it belonged to Mom." Another long silence settled between them. Then Michael carefully opened the journal. Near the center was a folded document. Its edges were worn from being unfolded too many times. William had never seen it before. "What is it?" Michael swallowed. "It's the reason I burned everything." William unfolded the paper. It wasn't a will. It wasn't a deed. It was a letter written by Helen only a few weeks before she died. Not addressed to William. Addressed to Michael. William began reading. "Michael. If you're reading this, it means I've probably run out of time to tell you these things myself. Your father will be heartbroken. He will also be vulnerable in ways he doesn't yet understand." William felt his chest tighten. The next paragraph changed everything. People will offer advice. Some will tell him to sell the house. Some will encourage him to rewrite his will. Others may convince him that holding on to the past is preventing him from moving forward. Promise me only one thing. Protect your father from people who mistake grief for opportunity. William slowly lowered the page. Neither man spoke. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "I thought I was keeping that promise." William looked at him. Michael's eyes were filled with tears. "A month after Mom's funeral. Your cousin Richard came to see me." William frowned. "Richard?" Michael nodded. "He said the family should convince you to sell the house before you changed your mind. He wanted part of the land developed." William searched his memory. He vaguely remembered Richard mentioning investors years ago. "I told him no." Michael continued. "But he kept insisting there were old documents that could complicate ownership. He said if those papers ever surfaced, the entire family could end up fighting over the property." William remained silent. "I didn't know whether he was telling the truth. I didn't understand half the legal language. So I went to Thomas." William listened carefully. "I asked for copies because I wanted to understand what Richard was talking about. What Thomas gave me only made me more confused." Michael looked toward the window. "Then I remembered Mom's letter. Protect your father. I convinced myself that if those old records disappeared, there would be nothing left for anyone to fight over." The room became completely still. For the first time, the burn barrel finally made sense. Not because Michael wanted to erase his father's past. Because he believed he was destroying the reason his family might someday tear itself apart. William looked back at Helen's letter. Then quietly asked, "Did you ever tell me any of this?" Michael closed his eyes. "No." "Why?" "Because the moment I lit that fire, I knew I'd protected you the wrong way." William didn't answer. He couldn't. Because he finally understood something that had taken 7 chapters to uncover. The greatest mistake Michael ever made wasn't burning the family box. It was believing that trusting his father was more dangerous than trusting his own fear. And for the first time since this story began, the fire was no longer just the beginning of the mystery. It had become the clearest symbol of everything their family had lost. William didn't speak for a long time. Helen's letter remained open in his hands, but he wasn't reading the words anymore. He was remembering the woman who had written them. She had asked Michael to protect him. She had never asked him to protect him from himself. Finally, William looked up. "You should have come to me." Michael nodded. "I know. You should have shown me this letter." "I know. You should have trusted me to decide what happened next." Michael's voice barely rose above a whisper. "I know." The room fell silent again. For the first time since the fire, Michael wasn't defending his decisions. He wasn't explaining them. He was simply accepting them. William closed Helen's journal and gently placed it on the table between them. "I've been asking the wrong question." Michael looked at him. "I kept asking why you burned the papers." He shook his head slowly. "That was never the real loss." Michael frowned. "It wasn't." William looked around the room. "When your mother died, I didn't lose my ability to think. I lost my confidence. I was grieving. I needed someone beside me." He paused. "I never needed someone in front of me." Michael lowered his eyes. William continued quietly. "Every decision you made, I believe you thought you were protecting me." Michael nodded, tears forming again. "I did. But every time you made one of those decisions, you taught everyone else to stop asking what I wanted." The words settled over the room with a weight neither man could escape. William thought about Daniel, Laura, Thomas, even Dr. Harris. None of them had intentionally ignored him. They had simply accepted the role Michael had quietly stepped into. Not because Michael demanded it. Because no one had questioned it. Including William. Then Michael reached into his jacket pocket. "There's something else." He removed a small envelope and slid it across the table. William looked at it without opening it. "What is it?" "I've been carrying it for 3 years." William slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a folded resignation letter. Not from a job. From something far more personal. Michael had written a formal document relinquishing his role as executor of William's estate. It was signed. Dated. But never delivered. William looked up. "You wrote this?" Michael nodded. 3 years ago. "Why didn't you give it to me?" Michael managed a faint, painful smile. "Because I didn't know how to admit that I no longer trusted myself." William stared at his son. For the first time, he realized Michael hadn't only been carrying guilt. He had been carrying fear. Fear that every decision he made might make things worse. Fear that he'd confused responsibility with control. Fear that one mistake had quietly become a lifetime of them. William carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. "You know what hurts the most?" Michael shook his head. "You never gave me the chance to tell you that you didn't have to carry all of this alone." Michael covered his face with both hands. For years, he believed he had failed because he wasn't strong enough. Now he realized he'd failed because he had tried to be strong by himself. William stood and walked toward the front door. Michael quickly looked up. Dad. His voice trembled. Are you leaving? William turned. Yes. Michael's face fell. I need some time. He wasn't walking away from his son. He was walking away from years of silence. As William reached the porch, Michael spoke one final sentence. If you decide you can't forgive me, I'll understand. William looked back at the son he'd raised. The son who had made terrible decisions. For reasons that had once seemed loving. Then he quietly replied. This was never going to be about forgiveness. Michael frowned. William's eyes filled with quiet sadness. It was always going to be about whether we could learn to trust each other again. And for the first time since the burn barrel filled the autumn sky with smoke, both men understood that rebuilding a family would take far longer than destroying a box of papers ever had. I didn't see Michael for almost 3 weeks. Not because he stopped calling. Because I asked him not to. For the first time in years, I needed to hear my own thoughts before I heard anyone else's. Every morning I walked the property Helen and I had built together. I repaired an old gate that didn't really need repairing. I planted flowers beneath the oak tree she'd loved. I even sat in the attic one afternoon, looking at the empty space where the family box had once rested. Strangely, it no longer made me think about the fire. It made me think about trust. Because the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Michael hadn't destroyed my memories. He destroyed my confidence that they belonged to me. One Saturday morning, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Michael was standing there. Alone. No toolbox. No paperwork. No explanations. Just my son. I know you asked for time, he said quietly. I'm not here to change your mind. William nodded. Then why are you here? Michael looked down at the porch. I found something. From behind his back, he held out a small wooden box. William recognized it immediately. It was one he'd built nearly 30 years earlier. Helen had used it to keep birthday cards, children's drawings, and little keepsakes that never fit anywhere else. I thought this burned too. Michael slowly shook his head. It was in the garage. I found it behind an old cabinet. William carefully opened the lid. Inside were dozens of small things that had no financial value whatsoever. A crayon drawing that Daniel had made in first grade. Michael's Little League participation ribbon. A dried flower Helen had pressed inside wax paper. A handwritten shopping list that ended with, "Don't forget William's favorite pie." William smiled through tears. For a moment. It felt as though Helen had walked back into the room. Michael quietly watched him. I almost threw that box away too. William looked up. Why didn't you? Michael answered honestly. Because I opened it. And I realized. I'd stopped seeing memories. I was only seeing paperwork. Neither man spoke. That sentence explained more than an hour of apologies ever could. Michael finally broke the silence. Dad. I've spent weeks trying to think of something I could say that would fix this. William gently closed the wooden box. There isn't. Michael nodded. I know. I thought if I explained my reasons, maybe you'd understand. William looked at his son. I do understand. Michael blinked. You do. I understand why you were afraid. I understand why you thought you were protecting me. I even understand why lighting that fire seemed like the right thing in that moment. Michael's shoulders relaxed for the first time. Then William continued. But understanding someone isn't the same as trusting them. The words landed harder than either of them expected. Michael lowered his head. I know. William stepped off the porch. For the first time since this began, he placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. When your mother died, I wasn't the only one who lost someone. You did too. Michael's eyes filled with tears. I never let myself grieve. William nodded. No. You tried to replace grief with responsibility. And responsibility without conversation always becomes control. Michael quietly wiped his eyes. I wish I'd understood that sooner. So do I. Several months later, the family gathered for Thanksgiving. It was the first holiday since everything had come to light. Something had changed. Not because the pain was gone. Because the silence was. Daniel asked William where he wanted everyone to sit. Laura asked him whether he wanted to keep the old house. Even the grandchildren came to him instead of assuming Michael already knew the answers. Michael noticed every one of those moments. And every time, he smiled. Not because he was being left out. Because, for the first time in years, his father had been given back something no document could ever guarantee. His voice. After dinner, Michael quietly handed William a small envelope. William opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No legal language. No signatures. Just one handwritten sentence. Dad, from now on, I'll never decide what's best for you without first asking what you want. William folded the note and slipped it into his shirt pocket. He didn't need another apology. He needed a promise. And this one had finally been made. As the family laughed together in the next room, William looked toward Helen's favorite chair. For just a moment, he imagined her smiling. Not because everything had been repaired, but because her family had finally learned the lesson she tried to teach them all along. Helping someone isn't taking away their choices. Real love asks. It doesn't assume. And that's the one truth no fire, no missing document, and no mistake could ever destroy. Before this story ends, I'd like to leave you with one thought. Sometimes, the deepest wounds in a family aren't caused by hatred. They're caused by love that slowly forgets to ask for permission. Michael never believed he was destroying his father's life. He believed he was protecting it. But the moment we begin making someone else's choices without their voice, even with the best intentions, love quietly turns into control. No matter how much we love our parents, our spouses, or our children, they deserve the dignity of making their own decisions. Real love doesn't silence. Real love listens. It doesn't assume. It asks. Because trust isn't built by protecting people from the truth, it's built by trusting them with it. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you were William? Could you forgive Michael after everything that happened, or would some mistakes be too painful to forget? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'd truly love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy heartfelt family stories about betrayal, karma, redemption, and powerful life lessons that stay with you long after the story ends, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Until next time, take care of the people you love, but never take away their right to choose.